Hello everyone, and welcome back to Spooky Hut. Tonight, get ready for an unforgettable journey into the world of spine-chilling, scary stories. Each story is crafted to stir fear and suspense, perfectly accompanied by the calming sound of rain to help you unwind as you drift off to sleep. Let us know your location and the time you're tuning in by dropping a comment below. If these eerie tales send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Now, dim the lights, sit back, relax, and let the scary stories take you on a haunting journey. I never believed the stories they told about the old factory. It was the kind of place with more rumors than work hours logged. People talked about strange noises, shadows moving where there shouldn't be any, and tools inexplicably falling from tables. I figured it was just bored workers trying to pass the time. At least, that's what I told myself before I took the night shift. My name is Ethan Carter, and I'm a 28-year-old night shift technician at Halverson Manufacturing, a metal fabrication plant on the outskirts of Lansing, Michigan. The place had seen better days. Half the machines were outdated relics, their rusted frames groaning under the weight of decades of wear and tear. Management wasn't keen on repairs, let alone the rumors of hauntings. It was my first week working alone on nights when I realized those stories weren't just stories. The first oddity happened around 11:45 p.m. I was in the maintenance bay, inspecting one of the CNC machines. The fluorescent lights above flickered occasionally, a small annoyance I'd grown used to. But this time, they didn't just flicker. They buzzed, dimmed entirely, and left me in near darkness. I flicked on my flashlight and aimed it at the breaker box across the room. That's when I saw it. A shadow darted across the far wall, too fast and too distinct to be a trick of the light. It moved like a person, but the way it bent and twisted wasn't natural. My stomach tightened as I scanned the room with the flashlight. Nothing. Just the same grimy tools and half-finished parts scattered around. Probably just my imagination, I muttered aloud, though my voice didn't sound convincing even to me. I shook it off and reset the breaker. The lights came back, but the uneasy feeling lingered. The second incident was worse. It was 2 a.m., and the factory was silent, except for the occasional hum of machinery. I was inspecting a hydraulic press when I heard footsteps. They were deliberate, heavy, and slow, boots against concrete. I froze, the wrench in my hand suddenly feeling like a flimsy weapon. "Hello?" I called out, trying to sound firm but betraying a nervous edge. The footsteps stopped, and I could hear my heart pounding in the silence. I walked toward the sound, rounding a corner into the assembly area. It was empty. Then, from somewhere behind me, a voice whispered, "Ethan." I spun around so fast I nearly dropped my flashlight. My breath came in quick gasps as the beam swept the area. No one was there. "Okay," I whispered to myself, trying to stay calm. "Just sleep deprivation. That's all." But deep down, I knew better. By the third night, I had a plan. Keep my head down, finish the tasks, and get out as quickly as possible. The eerie occurrences hadn't escalated beyond whispers and shadows, but they were enough to make every second unbearable. That night, I was assigned to clean out one of the old storage rooms. It was on the far end of the factory, a place no one liked to go. The air was damp and musty, and the flickering overhead light barely illuminated the room. Dust-coated shelves lined the walls, and old tools lay scattered like forgotten relics. As I started sorting through the mess, the temperature dropped. My breath became visible in front of me, a misty cloud that swirled unnaturally. The light above flickered, then dimmed, leaving me in a cold, eerie semi-darkness. And then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the back of the room. "Anyone there?" My voice cracked as I shone the flashlight toward the sound. There was a row of old filing cabinets at the end of the room. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. I took a hesitant step forward, then another. The air seemed heavier with every step. When I reached the cabinets, the tapping stopped. For a moment, The silence was suffocating. Then, one of the cabinet drawers slid open on its own with a metallic screech. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a toolbox. My flashlight beam wavered as I tried to catch my breath. Inside the open drawer, there was a single yellowed piece of paper. Trembling, I reached for it. It was a work order form, dated Chop, October 23rd, 1983. My blood ran cold when I saw the name. Ethan Carter. My name. But I wasn't even born in 1983. The events that followed shattered any lingering doubts I had about the factory being haunted. The lights failed entirely, plunging the room into darkness. My flashlight flickered as if the battery was dying, though I'd replaced it that afternoon. Then came the voices, whispered, overlapping voices, too many to distinguish. They were all around me, closing in. I bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. It felt as though something was holding it shut from the other side. Panic surged through me as I pounded on the metal, shouting for help, though I knew no one was around to hear. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were a deafening cacophony. Then, suddenly, silence. I turned around, my back pressed to the door. The beam of my flashlight illuminated the center of the room. There stood a figure. It was human-shaped, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its face, if you could call it that, was a featureless void. It took a step toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural. "Stay back!" I screamed, though my voice barely sounded over the pounding of my heart. The figure raised an arm, pointing directly at me. Then, in a voice that sounded like it came from everywhere and nowhere at once, it said, "You don't belong here." The door behind me suddenly gave way, and I tumbled into the hallway. The lights were on, the air was warm, and the factory sounded normal again. I didn't go back into that room. Instead, I grabbed my things and left, clocking out without saying a word to anyone. The next morning, I handed in my resignation. It's been 6 months since I left Halverson Manufacturing. I've tried to put the experience behind me, to rationalize it as stress, exhaustion, or even a vivid nightmare. But sometimes, late at night, I'll hear tapping on my bedroom window, or I'll catch a glimpse of a shadow that moves just a little too quickly. And every now and then, I'll dream of that figure in the storage room, standing silently, waiting for something. I don't know what it wanted, and I don't want to find out. I've always hated driving at night. It's not the darkness, the quiet roads, or even the eerie stillness that bothers me. It's the sense of being alone, vulnerable, with nothing but the hum of the engine and the glare of the headlights to keep me company. But what happened to me last October changed how I see late-night drives forever. It was around 11:45 p.m., and I was on my way back home from a late shift at the diner. The route I took was a desolate stretch of highway that cut through the outskirts of town, surrounded by endless woods and an occasional dilapidated house. My headlights pierced the inky blackness, but beyond that, it was as though the world ceased to exist. About halfway through my drive, I saw them, the faint glow of headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, it was comforting. It meant someone else was out here, and I wasn't entirely alone. But as I kept glancing back, I realized something unsettling. The car wasn't gaining on me. It wasn't falling behind either. It was just there. I shrugged it off. Maybe they were driving at the same speed as me. I pushed the thought aside, turned on the radio, and tried to focus on the road ahead. But something felt off. After about 15 minutes, I noticed the car was still there, maintaining the same distance. No matter how much I sped up or slowed down, it matched my pace. That's when a chill crept up my spine. I thought about pulling over to let them pass, but the idea of stopping on an empty highway in the middle of nowhere didn't sit right with me. Instead, I decided to take the next exit. If they followed, then I'd know something was wrong. The exit came into view, a narrow, poorly lit ramp that led to an old service road. I veered off, glancing in the mirror. My breath caught in my throat when I saw the car's headlights turning too. Okay, this is weird, I muttered, gripping the steering wheel tighter. The service road was even darker than the highway, lined with thick trees that loomed over like silent sentinels. I turned onto another road, and then another, hoping to lose them. But no matter where I went, those headlights followed. My heart pounded as I scanned for somewhere to stop. Up ahead, I spotted a small gas station. Closed, of course, but at least it had lights. I pulled into the lot, parking near the pumps. The car stopped too. I could see it now. A black sedan, its windows tinted so dark they looked like mirrors. The engine idled softly, a low rumble that seemed to echo in the still night. I rolled down my window, trying to see if anyone was inside, but the car just sat there, its headlights glaring at me like unblinking eyes. "Hey!" I shouted, though my voice cracked. "What do you want?" No response. Something primal, an instinctual dread, clawed at my chest. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but the call wouldn't go through. No signal. Of course. I looked back at the car, and that's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The headlights weren't casting any shadows. Not on the pumps, not on the ground. Nothing. It was as though the car wasn't really there. The engine revved suddenly, and the car lunged forward, stopping just inches from my bumper. I screamed, throwing the car into reverse and flooring it out of the lot. My tires screeched as I sped down the road, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The sedan followed. No matter how fast I drove, it stayed right behind me, its headlights filling my rearview mirror, blinding me. I swerved onto a back road, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. Then the strangest thing happened. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, like a ribbon of asphalt unraveling into nothingness. The trees on either side blurred together, and the car's headlights were the only constant. I don't know how long I drove. Minutes? Hours? Time felt meaningless. My mind raced with thoughts of ghost stories, urban legends, anything to make sense of what was happening. Finally, I saw it. A house, old and weathered, with a dim porch light flickering like a dying flame. Without thinking, I turned into the driveway and slammed on the brakes. The sedan stopped at the end of the driveway, its engine falling silent. I bolted out of my car, running to the house and pounding on the door. "Help! Please! Someone's following me!" The door creaked open, and an elderly man peered out. His eyes widened when he saw my panic. "What's wrong, son?" I turned to point at the car, but it was gone. "What?" I stammered, stepping back. "It was right there, a black car. It's been following me all night." The man's face darkened. "You said a black car?" "Yes." He nodded slowly, his expression grim. "Come inside, now." Once inside, he locked the door and motioned for me to sit. The house smelled of old wood and tobacco, and the walls were lined with faded photographs. "You're not the first," he said, lighting a cigarette with shaky hands. "That car, it's been seen around these parts for decades. Always at night, always on this stretch of road." "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "No one knows for sure," he said, exhaling a plume of smoke. "Some say it's a spirit, others think it's something darker, but everyone agrees on one thing. It doesn't stop until it gets what it wants." "And what does it want?" He looked at me, his eyes heavy with something I couldn't place. "That depends on you." A loud honk shattered the silence. I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat. The man grabbed my arm. "Listen to me. If you leave now, it'll follow you. You can't outrun it. You can't fight it. The only way to get rid of it is to face it." I didn't want to believe him, but what choice did I have? I stepped outside, my legs trembling. The sedan was back, idling at the end of the driveway, its headlights piercing the darkness. I walked toward it, every instinct screaming at me to run. The closer I got, the colder the air became, until my breath fogged in front of me. I stopped a few feet away. "What do you want?" I shouted. The engine roared and the car's horn blared, a sound so loud and guttural it felt like it was coming from inside my head. And then, silence. The car vanished, as if it had never been there. I stood there, frozen, the quiet night pressing in around me. I wish I could say that was the end of it, but sometimes, when I'm driving at night, I see headlights in my rearview mirror. And no matter where I go, they follow. I should have known better than to step foot into that house. But when desperation meets opportunity, logic often takes a back seat. I'll never forget the first time I saw it. A looming Victorian with faded gray siding, a sagging roof, and windows like empty eye sockets staring out at the world. It stood alone at the end of Pinewood Lane, shrouded in overgrown hedges and an eerie quietness that could make your skin crawl. My name is Matt, and I was 34 years old when I made the worst decision of my life. A freelance photographer struggling to make ends meet, I thought flipping a cheap fixer-upper would be my ticket out of debt. Little did I know, this house wasn't just run down, it was alive. The realtor had practically thrown the keys at me, barely stepping out of her car. "It's a steal," she said, her voice quivering. "But, there's a lot of history here. People say it's haunted." I laughed it off. I didn't believe in ghosts. To me, that kind of talk was just a marketing tool to scare away buyers. Haunted was code for bad plumbing and creaky floors. Besides, the house was dirt cheap, and I was confident I could flip it for a hefty profit. The first night in the house, I slept on a cot in the living room. The place had no electricity yet, so I relied on a couple of lanterns and my phone's flashlight. As I lay there, the wind howled through the broken shutters, and the house seemed to groan and creak as if settling into some long-forgotten pain. I chalked it up to the age of the place and tried to sleep. That's when I heard the first sound. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first, a soft scraping noise coming from upstairs. I froze, every muscle in my body tightening as I strained to listen. It came again, louder this time, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. "Just the wind," I muttered to myself, though I didn't entirely believe it. Gripping my flashlight, I crept up the staircase. Each step groaned under my weight, the sound echoing like a warning through the empty house. When I reached the top, the noise stopped. The hallway was dark and cold, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones. I swept my flashlight from side to side, illuminating peeling wallpaper and a cracked mirror at the end of the hall. Nothing seemed out of place, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I returned to my cot, forcing myself to brush it off. Old houses made noise. It was normal. But as I drifted off, I thought I heard it again. A faint whisper, so soft I almost convinced myself I imagined it. The next few days were uneventful, aside from the constant sense of unease that hung over me. I chalked it up to stress and the daunting task of renovating the place. But then the shadows started moving. It began subtly, a flicker of darkness at the edge of my vision, gone before I could fully register it. At first, I thought it was my eyes playing tricks on me, but it kept happening. One night, as I worked on sanding the floorboards in the dining room, I saw it clearly, a shadow darting across the room, even though I was the only one there. I dropped the sander and stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. Then a loud crash came from the kitchen. I bolted into the room, only to find the cabinet doors wide open, their contents spilled across the floor. My tools, which I'd neatly stacked on the counter, were now scattered, as if someone, or something, had thrown them in a fit of rage. This wasn't normal. By the third week, the house had become a nightmare. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, though I could never make out the words. Objects moved on their own. Chairs slid across the floor, doors slammed shut without warning, and the shadows. They weren't just darting around anymore. They lingered, hovering in corners, their outlines vaguely humanoid. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my bedroom door. Heavy, deliberate steps, like someone pacing back and forth. I grabbed the closest thing to a weapon, a wrench, and swung the door open, ready to confront whoever, or whatever, was tormenting me. The hallway was empty, but the air was thick, almost suffocating. That's when I noticed the writing on the walls. It was scratched into the peeling wallpaper, jagged and chaotic. "Leave now." My blood ran cold. I tried to leave. I packed my things, threw them into my car, and sped down Pinewood Lane. But no matter how far I drove, I always ended up back at the house. It was as if the road twisted and turned, leading me in circles. By dawn, I was sitting in the driveway, trembling and defeated. The house wouldn't let me go. The final straw came a week later. I'd stopped sleeping, too afraid of what might happen if I closed my eyes. My mind was fraying, unraveling under the weight of the house's oppressive presence. That night I heard it, the unmistakable sound of breathing. It was deep and guttural, coming from the corner of the living room where I'd set up my cot. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I swung it toward the sound, and there it was. A figure stood in the corner, its outline barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, unnaturally thin, and its eyes glowed a sickly yellow. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe as it stepped closer, the floorboards creaking under its weight. Its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, revealing jagged teeth. "You can't leave," it rasped, its voice a low growl that seemed to echo inside my skull. I screamed and ran, locking myself in the bathroom. The thing didn't follow, but I could hear it outside the door, its nails scratching against the wood. I don't know how long I stayed in that bathroom, hours, maybe days. When I finally worked up the courage to leave, the house was silent. But the message was clear. I was trapped. I've stopped trying to fight it. The house won't let me go, and I don't think it ever will. I've boarded up the windows and locked the doors, not to keep things out, but to keep whatever's inside from escaping. If you're reading this, consider it a warning. There are houses in this world that aren't just haunted, they're possessed. They're alive, and they hunger for those foolish enough to step inside. Stay away from Pinewood Lane. Stay away from the demon house. The end of this entry remains smudged, as if written by a trembling hand. Whoever wrote it, their fate remains unknown. I never believed in curses. Superstitions were just stories people told to scare tourists, or so I thought. That belief held strong until I set foot inside the tomb of Pharaoh Anchoretep. Now, as I sit in the dim light of my study, the relic from that cursed chamber staring at me, I know better. My name is Jack Preston, an archaeologist from New York City. I was 36 when I joined the excavation in Egypt that changed my life, and nearly ended it. The nightmares started the night we opened the sarcophagus. Our team had spent months digging through the endless sands of the Saqqara necropolis. The sun bore down mercilessly, and the air shimmered with heat. We weren't supposed to be there, not officially. A rival team had the permits, but we received a tip from a local guide about a hidden chamber beneath a crumbling temple. It was untouched, he swore. The kind of find that would make our careers. He wasn't lying. Beneath the shifting sands, we unearthed a concealed staircase leading into the earth. The stale air reeked of ancient decay as we descended, our flashlights casting flickering beams across walls etched with hieroglyphs. The chamber was breathtaking, a cavernous room with intricately painted murals depicting Anchoretep's journey to the afterlife. At the center, his sarcophagus loomed, an imposing slab of obsidian inlaid with gold. It was a masterpiece, undisturbed for thousands of years, until we disturbed it. "I'm telling you, this is a bad idea," whispered Tarek, our guide, his voice trembling. His usually steady hands were clutching his prayer beads. "Nonsense," scoffed Dr. Hammond, our expedition leader. "We're making history." The rest of the team agreed, though unease prickled the edges of my thoughts. Still, ambition outweighed caution. Together we pried open the sarcophagus. Inside lay the mummy of Pharaoh Ankaratep, wrapped in tattered linen, his face obscured by an ornate death mask. Resting on his chest was a small black amulet, carved from onyx. Strange hieroglyphs spiraled across its surface, their meaning lost to time. "That's coming back with us," Hammond declared, reaching for the amulet. The moment his fingers brushed it, a deafening sound erupted, a guttural groan that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The ground trembled and dust rained from the ceiling. Tariq screamed something in Arabic and bolted up the stairs. The rest of us froze, paralyzed by the unnatural sound. It was the first warning, and we ignored it. That night, back at our camp, the first death occurred. Tariq was found outside his tent, his body twisted in a grotesque manner. His eyes were wide open, his mouth frozen mid-scream. The doctor said it was a heart attack, but I'd never seen fear etched so deeply into someone's face. The team was rattled, but Hammond refused to abandon the dig. "We're on the verge of something incredible," he insisted, though I noticed his hands shook as he packed Tariq's belongings. The following days blurred together. We cataloged artifacts, took photographs, and sent preliminary reports to the museum funding our work. But the unease grew. At night, I heard whispers outside my tent, low, guttural murmurs in a language I didn't understand. My dreams were filled with shadowy figures and the oppressive weight of unseen eyes. And then, one by one, my colleagues started to die. Dr. Hammond was next. I found him in the main tent, slumped over his desk. At first I thought he'd fallen asleep, but the smell told me otherwise. His skin was pale and cold, his lips blue. The coroner's report would later say he'd suffered an aneurysm. By then, I knew it was no coincidence. I begged the remaining team members to leave, but greed had its grip on them. "There's no such thing as curses, Jack," scoffed Elena, our photographer. That night, Elena's tent went up in flames. After her death, I packed my belongings and fled. I left the artifacts, the photographs, and the reports. Everything except the amulet. I don't know why I took it. Maybe I thought I could break the curse, or maybe I was already under its spell. I returned to New York, but the horrors followed me. It started small, flickering lights, strange cold spots in my apartment, the feeling of being watched. Then the nightmares returned. Each night I dreamed of the Pharaoh's face, his hollow eyes staring into my soul as he whispered words I couldn't understand. Objects in my home moved on their own. My cat, Luna, hissed at empty corners and refused to come near me. Friends stopped visiting, claiming my apartment felt wrong. I didn't blame them. The worst came 3 weeks after my return. I was lying in bed, unable to sleep, when I heard it, the sound of shuffling footsteps. They were faint at first, like sand being dragged across the floor, but they grew louder, closer. My bedroom door creaked open, and my blood turned to ice. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim hallway light. It was wrapped in linen, its face obscured by a golden mask. The air grew heavy, and the figure raised an accusing hand, pointing directly at me. "You stole from the dead," it rasped, its voice like the rustle of ancient parchment. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure took a step closer, and the amulet on my nightstand began to glow with an eerie green light. "Return what is mine," it commanded. I don't remember much after that. When I woke, the figure was gone, but the amulet was warm to the touch. Desperate, I reached out to an Egyptologist friend, Dr. Malik. When I showed him the amulet, his face turned ashen. "This is a funerary curse marker," he said, his voice shaking. "It binds the soul of the deceased to their grave. If you removed it, you've unleashed their wrath." "What do?" I whispered. "Return it," he said. But even then, the dead do not forgive easily. I booked the first flight back to Egypt, the amulet clutched tightly in my pocket. The closer I got to the necropolis, the heavier it felt, as though it were resisting me. When I finally descended into the tomb, the air was thick with the stench of decay. The sarcophagus stood open, its occupant's linen wrappings now blackened and brittle. I placed the amulet back on the mummy's chest, whispering apologies into the oppressive silence. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the chamber grew unnaturally cold, and a low rumble filled the air. I stumbled back as the walls seemed to breathe, exhaling ancient dust. "You are not forgiven," a voice boomed, and the room plunged into darkness. I don't know how I escaped. I woke up outside the temple, my hands and knees raw from crawling through the sand. Now, back in New York, I can't escape the feeling that something followed me. The whispers haven't stopped, and at night I hear the shuffling of linen-wrapped feet. The Pharaoh's revenge isn't over, and I know it never will be. I always hated that house, even before the whispers started. It was an old Victorian monstrosity, inherited from my estranged uncle, a man whose name was rarely spoken in my family. The will was specific. I had to stay in the house for 1 month to claim it. My friends called it a golden opportunity. I called it a punishment. Still, the prospect of free real estate was enough to override my unease. The first week passed without much incident. The house creaked and groaned like any ancient structure, its walls settling into my presence. Or so I thought. I kept busy cleaning, sorting through dusty antiques, and trying not to choke on the pervasive smell of mildew. It was on the 8th night that I first heard the whispers. I was in bed, the room dimly lit by the orange glow of a bedside lamp. The sound was faint at first, like a breath brushing past my ear. I dismissed it as the wind, turned over, and closed my eyes. But then it came again, soft, fragmented words drifting down from above me. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to steady my voice. Silence. I grabbed the flashlight I'd been keeping by my bed, because yes, I had watched too many horror movies to not be prepared, and crept out into the hallway. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pointed the beam of light up the attic hatch in the ceiling. It was locked, just as it had been when I first moved in. I told myself it was probably just a raccoon or some other animal that had made its way inside. I'd call pest control in the morning. That was the logical thing to do. But the logic unraveled quickly. The next night, the whispers returned, louder this time. They came in intervals, a disjointed murmur that seemed to crawl under my skin. I couldn't make out the words, but they sounded urgent, almost pleading. I tried to sleep through it, but the whispers grew so insistent that I finally snapped. I pulled on my jacket, grabbed a crowbar, and yanked the attic ladder down with a loud clang. The air that rushed out smelled stale and faintly metallic, as if the attic had been sealed for decades. My flashlight beam danced across cobwebs and stacks of forgotten furniture, but nothing seemed out of place. At least, not at first. Then I saw it. In the far corner of the attic was a child's rocking chair, its paint chipped and peeling. Sitting in the chair was a doll, its porcelain face cracked and one glassy eye missing. My stomach turned. I hated dolls. Always had. I approached it slowly, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight. The whispers seemed to intensify with each step I took, though I couldn't pinpoint their source. When I reached the doll, the sound stopped entirely. I stared at the thing for a long time, half expecting it to move. It didn't. Feeling ridiculous, I picked it up and inspected it. There was nothing remarkable about it, just a creepy old doll abandoned in an attic. But when I turned to leave, I felt a chill rush down my spine. Behind me, the rocking chair began to sway. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. The whispers returned, louder than ever, circling me like a storm. They weren't coming from the attic anymore. They were inside my head. "Get out!" they hissed, the voices overlapping in a cacophony of rage and desperation. I stumbled back, dropping the doll. It hit the floor with a sickening crack, and the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I decided I was done. The house could rot for all I cared. I packed my bags and prepared to leave, but as I reached the front door, I found it stuck. No, not stuck, locked. I hadn't locked it. Frantic, I fumbled with the deadbolt, but it wouldn't budge. I tried the back door, then the windows. Every exit was sealed tight. The whispers returned, faint but unmistakable, and this time they were accompanied by a rhythmic thud from above, the attic. I didn't want to go back up there, but I didn't have a choice. If something or someone was keeping me trapped, I needed to confront it. The attic ladder felt colder than before, the air above heavy and oppressive. When I reached the top, the sight that greeted me made my blood run cold. The doll was back in the rocking chair, but it wasn't alone. Surrounding it were dozens of other dolls, all arranged in a circle, their lifeless eyes staring straight at me. The whispers turned into laughter, high-pitched and cruel. I backed away, my flashlight flickering as if mocking my fear. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. One of the dolls turned its head, its cracked smile widening impossibly. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "This isn't real." But it was. The dolls began to move, their tiny limbs creaking as they crawled toward me. The laughter grew louder, mingling with the whispers until I could barely think. I scrambled down the ladder, slamming it shut behind me, but I knew it wouldn't hold them for long. I locked myself in the bedroom, my heart pounding as I pushed furniture against the door. The whispers seeped through the walls, relentless and unending. And then, for the first time, I understood the words. "You belong to us." The door rattled violently and I screamed. This was no longer about the house or the inheritance. This was about survival. Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was already too late. As I write this, the whispers are all around me, louder than ever. I don't know if anyone will find this note, but if you do, heed my warning. Stay away from this house. And if you hear the whispers, run. Run before they claim you too. When I agreed to take the overnight tour of Alcatraz, I didn't think much of it. A dare from friends during a drunken night of poker had landed me here, alone, on the last ferry to the infamous island. It seemed harmless enough. Spend the night in a historic prison, document it, and prove ghosts don't exist. Simple, right? But as I stepped off the boat and the cold wind off the bay wrapped around me like a clammy hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a joke anymore. My name is Eric Mendoza, 29, an aspiring journalist from Oakland, California. I've chased stories in gritty neighborhoods and even interviewed gang members, but none of that prepared me for the oppressive weight of Alcatraz. The stories about spirits, the cries of long-dead prisoners, and shadows that moved where they shouldn't. It all felt like exaggerated campfire tales. Until I stepped inside, the main cell block smelled of damp stone and rusted metal. The tour guide had already left after pointing me toward a small cot in what used to be the warden's office. "Good luck," he'd said with a smirk, before his footsteps disappeared down the dock. I stood in the eerie silence, my flashlight casting jagged shadows on the peeling paint of the walls. The isolation was crushing. Every sound echoed unnaturally. The squeak of my shoes, the faint drip of water, and the occasional gust of wind howling through broken windows. I walked past row after row of tiny cells, trying to ignore the shiver crawling up my spine. A metal cup rattled on the floor behind me. I spun around, heart hammering. Nothing. Just an overturned cup lying inside one of the cells. I laughed nervously, shaking my head. "Wind," I whispered to myself. "Just the wind." But then the temperature plummeted. By the time I reached the infamous D block, the air felt heavy, suffocating. This was where they kept the worst of the worst. Murderers, escape artists, and the criminally insane. Solitary confinement. The whole. I stepped into one of the cells and turned off my flashlight, curious to see how pitch black it would get. The darkness swallowed me whole. That's when I heard it, a faint guttural whisper so low I thought it might have been my imagination. Then it came again, clearer this time, scraping against my ears like nails on a chalkboard. "Get out." I fumbled for my flashlight, my breath caught in my throat. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, revealing the barren cell. Nothing was there, but the feeling wasn't gone. I turned to leave, but my legs felt leaden, as if something invisible was holding me back. And then I saw it, a faint figure in the cell across from me. A man, or at least what used to be a man. His face was pale, his eyes dark and sunken, and his prison uniform hung from his skeletal frame like wet rags. He wasn't moving, just staring at me. Panic clawed at my chest as I stumbled backward, my flashlight trembling in my grip. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, but the figure didn't disappear. Instead, it stepped forward, passing through the bars like smoke. I bolted, my boots clanging against the metal grates of the floor as I raced down the corridor. My heart pounded like a drum, the sound almost drowning out the faint whispers that seemed to follow me. "Eric." Hearing my name stopped me cold. "Eric," the voice repeated, this time louder, clearer, and dripping with malice. I whipped around, my flashlight catching glimpses of shadowy figures slithering along the walls. They weren't human, at least not anymore. Their forms twisted and contorted, their faces grotesque masks of agony. "You don't belong here," one of them rasped, its voice echoing like it came from the bottom of a well. I burst out of D-block, only to find myself in the prison yard. The fog had rolled in thick, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. I could still hear the whispers, closer now, more insistent. That's when I saw the lighthouse, its beam piercing the fog. A beacon of sanity in this nightmare. I ran toward it, desperate for safety, but the ground seemed to shift beneath my feet. No matter how far I ran, the lighthouse stayed the same distance away. Behind me, the whispers turned to screams. I glanced back and my blood froze. The shadowy figures were no longer shadows. They were solid, tangible things, crawling and limping after me with impossible speed. I tripped and fell, landing hard on the cold, wet concrete. My flashlight skittered away, its beam dancing wildly across the yard before dying. I was plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the lighthouse. The screams grew louder, deafening, and then stopped. Silence. A hand grabbed my ankle. I screamed and kicked, but the grip was unrelenting, icy and strong. I could barely see it, a rotting hand, its flesh peeling away to reveal bone. I thrashed and clawed at the ground, but I was being dragged, pulled back toward the prison. "No," I yelled, my voice echoing in the emptiness. The whispers returned, this time in unison, chanting something I couldn't understand. It wasn't English. It wasn't any language I'd ever heard. I don't remember how I broke free. Adrenaline, desperation, sheer terror, maybe all three. But somehow, I found myself running again, my legs screaming in protest. I reached the dock just as the first hints of dawn touched the horizon. The ferry was there, its horn cutting through the fog like a lifeline. I didn't stop to think. I jumped aboard, collapsing onto the deck as the boat pulled away from the island. As Alcatraz faded into the distance, I thought I was safe. But then I saw it, my reflection in the boat's window. There was someone standing behind me. It's been weeks since that night, but I can't shake the feeling that I didn't leave Alcatraz alone. I hear whispers in my apartment, see shadows where there shouldn't be any. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I feel a cold hand on my ankle. I wasn't sure what possessed me to go back there, to that dead, rotting carnival that everyone in town said was cursed. Maybe it was the lure of proving everyone wrong, or maybe it was sheer stupidity. Either way, standing at the rusted gates of the old Magnolia Fairgrounds, with the cold October wind biting at my skin, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was making a huge mistake. The stories about the carnival had been around for as long as I could remember. People whispered about lights flickering on in the dead of night, eerie music drifting from nowhere, and shadows that moved when no one was there. They said the place was haunted, cursed by the death of the owner, Mr. Leopold, and his mysterious traveling troupe. But I didn't believe in ghosts, at least, not until that night. It started with a dare from my best friend, Nate. We were sitting in my garage, a couple of beers deep, swapping the same old stories we always told around Halloween. "You've got guts, Ryan," he said, smirking, "but I bet you wouldn't last an hour in the Magnolia Fairgrounds after dark." "An hour?" I scoffed. "Make it 2. He raised an eyebrow, his smirk growing. "You're on, but you have to go alone." I could never back down from a challenge. That's how I found myself here, standing under the creaking sign that read, "Magnolia's Magical World of Wonders." Its faded paint peeling like dead skin. My flashlight barely cut through the inky darkness as I pushed the gates open, the hinges screeching like they hadn't been moved in decades. The place smelled of decay and rust, a sharp tang in the air that made me gag. Broken rides loomed like skeletal beasts, their shadows twisting and shifting under the pale moonlight. The Ferris wheel was the worst, its towering frame swaying slightly in the wind, each groan of metal making my stomach churn. I decided to stick to the main path, a cracked and overgrown trail that wound past the funhouse, the bumper cars, and the carousel. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of my boots on gravel. Then I heard it. Music. It was faint at first, almost like a distant hum, but as I moved closer to the carousel, it grew louder, a tinny, off-key rendition of Pop Goes the Weasel. My heart pounded against my ribs as I swung the flashlight beam wildly, looking for a source. The carousel was motionless, its painted horses chipped and weathered, their eyes dull and lifeless. But the music was coming from there. Before I could convince myself to turn back, the carousel lit up. The bulbs around its edges flickered to life in bursts of pale, sickly light. The horses began to move, their mechanical joints groaning and snapping into action. My breath caught in my throat as I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a broken bench. "Okay, very funny, Nate," I called out, my voice shaking. "You win. Let's go." No response. The music swelled, louder and louder, until it felt like it was drilling into my skull. The horses moved faster, their painted faces twisting into something grotesque, their once dull eyes glowing a hellish red. I ran. My legs felt like lead, and the path seemed endless. But I didn't stop until I was at the center of the fairgrounds, where the main stage stood. The music had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. Then I saw them. Figures. They were standing in the shadows, barely illuminated by the moonlight. At first, I thought they were mannequins, left behind from the carnival's glory days. But mannequins don't move. One by one, they stepped forward, their faces obscured by masks. A clown with smeared makeup and a grin that stretched too wide. A ringmaster with empty, hollow eyes, a contortionist whose limbs bent at impossible angles. They formed a circle around me, their movements jerky and unnatural, like puppets on strings. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice breaking. The ringmaster tilted his head, his hollow eyes locking onto mine. His mouth didn't move, but I heard his voice clear as day. "Welcome back, Ryan. We've been waiting for you." I froze. "How do you know my name?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The clown cackled, the sound sharp and grating. "You've always belonged to us," it hissed. I turned to run, but the contortionist was suddenly in front of me, her body twisting and snapping as she blocked my path. "Stay," she whispered, her voice like nails on a chalkboard. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for my phone, but before I could turn on its light, something cold and clammy grabbed my wrist. I screamed, yanking my arm free and stumbling backward. When my phone's flashlight finally flickered on, the figures were gone. The stage was empty, but the carnival wasn't. The rides were moving now, all of them. The Ferris wheel spun wildly, its lights flashing in a chaotic rhythm. The bumper cars collided violently, sparks flying. The funhouse mirrors glowed, their reflections twisting and warping into monstrous shapes. The air was filled with laughter, high-pitched and maniacal, echoing from every direction. "Ryan," a voice called, soft and sing-song. I spun around, the beam of my phone's light landing on the clown. It was closer now, its grin impossibly wide, its painted face cracking like porcelain. "Play with us," it whispered, extending a hand. "No," I shouted, backing away. But the carnival had other plans. The ground beneath me shifted, and I fell, tumbling down a steep incline. I landed hard in what felt like sand, the smell of sawdust filling my nose. I was in the center ring of the big top, the striped tent towering above me. The audience was full. Row after row of shadowy figures sat in the stands, their faces hidden in darkness. But I could feel their eyes on me, hundreds of them, unblinking and cold. The ringmaster stepped into the spotlight, his hollow eyes glowing faintly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, his voice echoing through the tent. "Tonight, a special performance, The Boy Who Thought He Could Escape Us." The audience erupted into applause, their claps unnaturally loud like thunder. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing. "Let me go," I shouted. The ringmaster chuckled, a deep, guttural sound. "You've already joined the show, Ryan. There's no leaving now." The shadows descended on me, their cold, clammy hands grabbing and pulling me toward the center ring. I thrashed and screamed, but it was no use. The ringmaster raised his cane, and everything went black. When I woke up, I was back at the gates of the carnival, the sun rising in the distance. My clothes were torn, my body aching, but I was alive. I stumbled home, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. But as I passed my reflection in a shop window, I froze. My face was pale, my eyes hollow, and painted across my lips was a crimson smile, stretching too wide. The carnival had marked me, and deep down, I knew I'd never truly left. I've always been someone who pays attention to my surroundings. Growing up in a small town nestled between endless stretches of dense woods and forgotten farmland, I learned early to trust my gut. But sometimes, even the sharpest instincts fail. Sometimes, the things watching you are the ones you can't comprehend. It started on an unseasonably warm October evening. My name is Jake, and I was 28 at the time, living in an aging rental house on the edge of a sprawling forest in upstate New York. The place had character, sure, but it also creaked and groaned like a living thing. The kind of house you told yourself wasn't haunted, but you never quite believed it. I was sitting on my back porch, a cold beer sweating in my hand, the woods swallowing up the fading sunlight in a way that felt unnatural. My dog Rusty, a mutt with a nose for trouble, was unusually restless. He paced back and forth, growling low in his throat, and occasionally snapping his head toward the trees. "Calm down, bud," I muttered, trying to relax. But even as I said it, I felt it, a shift in the air, like the forest was holding its breath. That's when I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the tree line. At first I thought it was a person, maybe a hunter or a hiker who had wandered too close to my property. But the way they stood there, completely still, not swaying with the wind or shifting their weight, set my teeth on edge. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, and clothed in what looked like layers of torn fabric, or maybe animal hides. It was hard to tell in the growing darkness. Their head tilted slightly as if studying me, and that's when I noticed there were no eyes. Just dark hollows where eyes should have been. I blinked, and they were gone. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I left the porch light on. Rusty curled at the foot of my bed, his ears perked and alert. Every creak of the house felt amplified, every distant rustle of leaves outside a potential threat. When I finally did drift off, It was restless, filled with fractured dreams of hollow-eyed figures standing at the foot of my bed. The next morning, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Maybe it was the beer, or maybe I'd seen a shadow from the woods that my mind twisted into something sinister. But Rusty wouldn't stop pacing near the back door, his tail tucked low, ears flattened. He kept glancing toward the woods as if expecting something to emerge. I tried to go about my day, but the feeling of being watched never left. I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows darting between the trees, too quick and too tall to be deer. Once, I thought I saw a face pressed against the window of my kitchen, but when I whipped around, it was gone. By nightfall, my nerves were shot. I decided to call my friend Mark, the closest thing I had to backup. He was a skeptic, the kind of guy who thought ghost stories were for gullible fools, but he agreed to come over and keep me company. I figured 2 heads were better than 1. Mark arrived with a 6-pack and a flashlight, laughing at my paranoia. "You probably saw some kind of animal," he said, cracking open a beer. "Or maybe some weirdo living out in the woods. Happens more than you'd think." "Yeah, maybe," I said, but even I didn't believe it anymore. Around midnight, we were sitting in the living room when the sound started. It was faint at first, like a low hum or a distant whistle, but it grew louder, closer. It wasn't a natural sound. It was disjointed, almost like static, interspersed with what sounded like distorted whispers. Rusty shot up, barking wildly at the door. Mark grabbed the flashlight and nodded toward me. "Let's check it out." Every fiber of my being screamed not to open that door, but I couldn't let Mark go out there alone. We stepped onto the porch, the beam of the flashlight slicing through the oppressive darkness. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. Then we saw them. Not one figure, but several. They stood at the edge of the yard, just beyond the reach of the porch light. There were 6, maybe 7, all unnaturally tall, their limbs too long, their heads tilted at odd angles. Their faces, or what should have been faces, were voids, black and endless. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, they just stood there, watching. Mark, for all his skepticism, froze. "What the hell?" he whispered, his voice trembling. I grabbed his arm. "We need to go inside. Now." As soon as we turned, the sound started again, louder, more insistent, like it was pressing against my skull. Rusty barked furiously from inside, his silhouette visible through the window. I yanked Mark back inside and locked the door, my hands shaking. "They're just standing there," Mark said, peeking through the blinds. "What do they want?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that they weren't human, and they weren't going to leave. The rest of the night was a blur of terror. The figures didn't move, didn't try to approach the house, but their presence was suffocating. Every time I tried to look at them directly, my vision blurred, like my brain was rejecting their existence. Mark and I stayed up, armed with kitchen knives and a baseball bat, though deep down we knew it wouldn't help. By dawn, they were gone. Mark left as soon as the sun rose, muttering something about needing to clear his head. I didn't blame him. I wanted to leave too, but this was my home, and part of me was stubborn enough to think I could handle it. For a while, it seemed like I was right. Days passed without incident. The woods were still eerie, and I kept the curtains drawn at all times, but there were no more sightings. Rusty seemed calmer, and I let myself believe it was over, until I found the footprints. They were pressed into the soft dirt of my backyard, impossibly large, with long clawed toes. They circled the house in a perfect loop, stopping directly beneath every window. That night, I barricaded myself in my room, Rusty by my side. The sound returned, louder than ever, filling the house with its maddening static. The figures were back, closer this time, their hollow faces nearly pressed against the windows. I knew they could get in if they wanted to. The locks, the barricades, they were meaningless. I don't know what they were or what they wanted, but I knew one thing. They weren't going to stop. The last thing I remember before blacking out was the sound of the front door creaking open. When I woke up, It was morning. The house was undisturbed, no sign of forced entry, no figures in the yard. Rusty was curled up beside me, calm as ever. But something was different. Off. The air felt heavier, the shadows darker, and then I noticed the scratch marks on the inside of the front door. They weren't there before. I don't know if they'll come back, but if they do, I don't think I'll survive the next encounter.